Very nice introduction, and good morning. Happy Thanksgiving to, at least to me, I'm sure others in the crowd are celebrating. In the spirit of the Thanksgiving holiday, I figured I'd start by giving you a few people I'm grateful for. Of course, my wife and son, Elliot, who came out here with me. Elliot has now been to more countries than 2/3 of Americans. He's 7 months old. So that will fit into the rest of my presentation in a minute. Second to Gunter, for his kind invite to me. I'm quoting President Trump here, to this huge hellhole. Of course, I'm joking. I love the land of waffles and chocolate and beer and fries, and I frankly find it weird to criticize Belgium because those are four of Americans' primary food groups, so he should love it here. Second to Ambassador Verbeke, who I was lucky enough to get to know when he was the ambassador to the United States, and I think helped originally make that introduction to Gunter. Also, I appreciate the call out to Steve Jobs in the previous presentation because I see him sitting here in the first row. So it's an honor to be here with you, Mr. Jobs. It's an honor to join the Brussels Diplomatic Academy for this incredible conference you pulled together today. I think by the end of the day you'll have tackled pretty much all of the problems we have in the world, which is a nice gesture before the holidays, so good planning around that. I was invited to tell, I think, an American story, but one I believe has increasing resonance in Belgium and Europe. And it's not primarily about economic diplomacy in the traditional sense. The reason why is we've really stopped talking productively about trade and other international issues like immigration in the US. And this presentation is really my attempt to try to figure out why that is and how we get past the point we are now in our politics and frankly in our economics. You know, in reflecting upon Thanksgiving, there's really no more American holiday than Thanksgiving. Not just because of football, or as you say in Europe, football, but also because it tells this story of pilgrims coming to the US in the 1600s as religious separatists seeking freedom and a new life. And we've lost so much of that understanding of our history in this presidency, in the Trump presidency. We've forgotten what it is to accept and embrace immigrants and refugees. My grandparents came to the US as refugees from Europe. After living in a displaced persons camp in Italy without the US welcoming them, I wouldn't be here. And so I'm trying to figure out what's going on with that. At the same time, I'm not going to dismiss Trumpism or other forms of right-wing populism as if they're not rooted in real economic and cultural anxiety. Anxiety that's felt by a large number of Americans and a large number of Europeans. As Ms. von Koster noted, they're concerned, and there's a real concern, and I think I'll be able to show in at least some of the data, that the economy and the economic recovery hasn't worked for a larger number of people than I think we recognize. So American voters made Trump president not in spite of his flaws, but because he was hoping that maybe he was crazy enough to upend the American political establishment, to blow up the world order, to totally change the form of capitalism we have in the US and beyond. And it's starting. The US may have leapfrogged Europe's right-wing populism, but let's be clear, right-wing parties are on the rise throughout Europe. 7 countries in the EU have right-wing parties that have now captured more than 20% of the vote. The Freedom Party in Austria, the Danish People's Party, the National Front in France, Jobbik in Hungary, Law and Justice in Poland, the Swiss People's Party. Not in Belgium, yes, in Belgium too. The New Flemish Alliance, separatists right here in Belgium. And so why are we seeing so much anger and anxiety? We're in the 9th year of a so-called economic recovery. And at least I'll speak for the US, but I'll show some examples of this in Europe as well. For half of the US, the economic recovery hasn't worked at all. Regional inequality, declining rates of entrepreneurship. Dr. Dunn and I did not coordinate at all before this, but I'm going to echo at least some of what he talked about when he talked about the declining creative destruction, which is an important phenomenon. Increasingly powerful corporate monopolies. And this sense for many communities that they're trapped in this downward spiral of aging industries, of low-wage jobs, of depressed investments, of little hope for the future. It's not because they perceive these things that I'm concerned, it's because these things are economically true. They're validated by the data. It's also going to touch upon the fact that it's not this notion that globalization and technology are destroying too much of our economy. That's not really the problem, and that's not really what the data supports. The problem is we're not creating enough. We're not creating enough in Belgium, which has extremely low rates of entrepreneurship that I'll talk about a little bit, and we're not creating enough in the US. So Western economies, I would argue, are facing a crisis of epic proportions. These divides among winners and losers on geographic lines have the capacity to rip apart our institutions, destroy the legitimacy of democratic politics, and can and already are leading to social unrest. Plenty of ink has been spilled on income inequality. That's not what I'm here to talk to you about. I'm talking about the opportunity between the connected and the disconnected, the large city and the small town, the corporate monopoly and the entrepreneur. And these trends are exacerbating the lack of economic opportunity in too many communities. So if I was titling the conference today, rather than securing our economic prosperity, I'd just change a few words. I'd say securing more broadly shared economic prosperity. It's the central economic challenge faced by both the US and Europe, even if we don't fully realize what that means yet. So just a few small digressions about my background. I spent 4 years working for President Obama, basically during his entirety of his first term. I spent the first half of that as the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Foreign Commercial Service, which is the commercial diplomacy vehicle of the U.S. government, and the second half working largely on economic policy issues at the White House. I spent a lot of that time both conceiving of policies and finding ways to talk to the American public about what the president had done to help keep the US and frankly much of the rest of the world from falling over the brink of an economic disaster. And I'm proud of that work, and I'm proud of the president's leadership of that work. But despite the fact that the US is achieving 2 to 3% national GDP growth, which doesn't sound like a lot, but probably feels pretty good from a European perspective. Our unemployment rate's 4%, essentially full employment. The stock market and corporate profits are at record highs. A majority of Americans are really angry about the economy. And that paradox is what led me to found the Economic Innovation Group. And the Economic Innovation Group, essentially all we do is look at regional inequality in the US and try to figure out how you help grow left-behind communities. So I have a few slides here. I didn't want to feel left out. Is there a button? Third, they're robust and diversified knowledge economies. They oftentimes have research universities, multiple research universities. The flip side of this, if you're a community that's primarily dominated by an industrial or agricultural sector, you're likely to be among the least dynamic economies. If you look at the places that are struggling in the US, it's places like the industrial Midwest, it's the Detroits and Clevelands and Milwaukees and Buffaloes and Baltimores of the world, and places in the rural South. If you look at Belgium, it's the south of Belgium. It's the parts of Belgium that used to have robust industrial economies and have struggled to keep up with much of the rest of Europe. Fourth, the cities are connected to investors and lenders and capital markets, and they spread that capital across neighborhoods. Access to capital, I'd argue, is the fundamentally most important question. It's the lifeblood of business creation. It's the only way you create the type of economic activity that reverses a downward spiral and creates a new virtuous cycle of investment. Fifth, and I'll talk about this a little more, they have really rich entrepreneurial ecosystems. And that's a really big deal. And that means everything from establishing incubators and accelerator spaces to lower regulatory barriers for entrepreneurs to publicly funded angel and venture capital funds. Belgium does not do great on this score, although it's doing better. I'll talk about that a little bit. In recent years, there have been some big changes, at least in some of the Belgian policy thinking about how to address, attract, and scale entrepreneurship. Sixth, they have a substantial public-private partnerships, and really what that means is, in addition to the relationship between the private sector and things like vocational skills and vocational schools and skills apparatus, it's this idea that of having local mentors, of people who are personally invested in the community, who have the capital, the skills, the know-how to help build those new networks of businesses. Peace alone. There is this notion, I think has been a notion for a long time in the US, that this is a problem for the government to solve. And it's really not. It's not a problem exclusively for the government to solve, at least, and that's because the government doesn't have the capital, or in a lot of times the know-how, to be able to do these sort of things that are on this list. To really build a private sector ecosystem, you need the private sector engaged. And seventh, and I'll talk about this a little more, these are places that are physically and digitally connected. They're plugged into networks of people, of goods, and information. So what can we do? We have to do a lot. The good news is that America and Europe have a long history of making investment in places that have fallen behind. This is a key piece of President Roosevelt's New Deal agenda in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. It was developing the West, developing rural America, helping then cities in America transition from being an agricultural to an industrial economy. It's when we invested in rural electrification. We invested in the international highway system, not international highway system, the interstate highway system. We made big investments in how to connect people and places with the new economy. And today, those Western states, when FDR was president, which were nowhere on the economic map, are now have the most diverse, the most dynamic, the most technologically enabled economies in the US. And yet, unlike then, we have no real place-based agenda in the US now. And despite the billions that Europe has invested, it's not getting any closer to achieving its mission either. So, strikes me we need a new agenda. One that is able to find a set of solutions that will ensure we don't get bogged down in the all too common scapegoats of globalization, of immigration, of technology. With the exception of the manufacturing sector, this is a small digression, there's very little evidence in the US that globalization and technology are destroying too many jobs. Very hard to make that case. Productivity levels are so low. Unemployment is basically at record lows. Wages are also record low. Robots are not taking over the US economy, at least not right now. And the opposite is really true. And so if you were going to focus on one area of national, regional, or local focus, it should be on entrepreneurship and new business creation. Belgium has a long way to go. It has really low rates of startup activity, as Dr. Dine pointed out. It has very high regulatory burdens. It has not a great tax regime if you're a new business. And surprisingly, Belgium ranks last among EU countries in terms of entrepreneurship culture. Some has happened recently, I'll talk about that in a quick second, but here are at least three things I do. One, I create and ensure entrepreneurship visas in every country were tied to geographies of need within those countries. Two, adopting regulatory reform. Some are really low-hanging fruit. Non-compete agreements in the state of California in the US are basically unenforceable. And the other 49 states are huge barriers to new businesses, spinning out of companies and seeding them in communities. And they seem to actually be having some early success here, but I'd argue not good enough unless tied to where there's geographic need in Belgium, and not good enough unless tied more broadly to where there's geographic need across Europe in terms of other incentive other European countries are considering. One other thing I'd point to in terms of a trend, which is probably worthy of a whole other conversation, the decline in business starts in the US is closely connected with the rise of corporate concentration in the US. This is also true in Europe. The 21st century economy is basically a golden age for incumbents, big incumbent companies. And since the late 1990s, 2/3 of American industries saw an increase in market concentration. By 2012, the 4 largest companies had captured at least 25% of the market in half of US industries. In 1 in 7 US industries, 4 companies have 50% of the market. Telecommunications, department stores, hospitals, airlines, automobile manufacturers, internet companies. In Belgium, several industries show a similarly high degree of concentration. Sectors like telecom, IT, transportation. Corporate profits in the US as a share of GDP have doubled in 20 years, unprecedented heights. And yet, that hasn't been accompanied by increased investment. Investment rates are lower in the US. Innovation rates are lower in the US. Workforce wages are lower in the US, or at least the growth of workforce wages are lower. And part of it is because there's a premium paid to large companies in this new area of globalization. And this is a place diplomats can step up. One, and I'd say most centrally, it's entrepreneurship diplomacy ought to be a centerpiece of economic diplomacy. It's both in terms of whom commercial diplomats support and the tactics they use to support entrepreneurship around the world. So commercial diplomacy should increasingly target smaller towns and regions, as well as smaller companies that are struggling to break through. This is not something that currently happens very much in the US. It would be actually a dramatic reversal to how we spend most of our resources. Much of the time spent by US commercial diplomats is around securing big deals, whether it's export financing, or it's advocacy for a big foreign procurement, or it's large-scale trade negotiations. Increasingly, also governments have to change the way they connect companies to diplomacy. So we basically operate with a 20th century analog of international business matchmaking. You physically talk with a commercial diplomat or a local office. They physically connect you with a company abroad. We have very little in terms of a 21st century digitally enabled hub of information or matchmaking. I can tell you that from firsthand experience. When I worked for President Obama, I had a very simple task. I had a whole array of challenges. Some of them were the US and China economic relationships. Some of it was dealing with the GOP. That paled in comparison to doing something that seemed very easy. It was to get the government bureaucracies in charge of trade agencies. There are 19 trade agencies in the US that touch companies, to get them to work together. Create one simple digital platform that companies could utilize to share at the back end their information, to avoid duplication of what services we were providing. If you had this digital framework, you could reach companies all over the country. And I failed, badly. Commercial diplomats basically use very little technology still in doing what they do. The agencies rejected something that might cost them jobs, might cost them part of their mission. I don't know if the case is similar in Europe. I'm sure the bureaucracy here works quite well. But I'll let you guys discuss that. With all that being said, and I'm obviously the comic relief here for the day, the flaws and shortcomings in the US still leave one thing true. We are still the most entrepreneurial country in the world by many measures. In addition to Silicon Valley, Boston, and New York, you have less known places like Austin, Denver, and Salt Lake City, and so does Europe. Very few places can hold a candle to Amsterdam, to London, to Stockholm for their ability to see new businesses. I hope Brussels will find itself in that mix quite soon with some of the reforms we're seeing here. But as Western governors face this reality, they have less capital, less government capital to invest. As the corporate sector remains largely uninterested in investing in places left behind, diplomats have this responsibility, or at least an opportunity, to empower entrepreneurs, to invest time and resources in them, to deploy them in underserved places around the world. That's not just within the US and Europe, that's also in places like Africa and the Middle East and Asia, where US and European entrepreneurs could have a huge impact. So let's face it, regional inequality in the US and Europe is not just a political and economic failing, it's a moral failing. And our societies can no longer afford to ignore it. We can complain about the rise in populism, about the insecurity, the anxiety, and oftentimes the hate that is expressed through this populism, or we could recognize it for what it is, a feeling that people are being left behind. So to the extent we care about the American and the EU political experiment, I think it starts with understanding this fundamental baseline. To the extent we care about global cooperation, about new trade deals, about not regressing from where we've gone in terms of our international trade framework, I think it starts here. And to the extent we want to do more economic good for more people in both the US and Europe, I'd argue it starts here. Thank you.